Okay. John, are you receiving us loud and clear?
I can hear you just fine, Jimmy. Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. Well, first thing I want to do, John, is formally welcome you to the little band of revolutionaries that meet every Sunday. We haven't been too successful because we've met in a long time yet, and we still haven't organised the world revolution. So the best we can do is share our ideas, share our experiences, share understanding, and invite other people to educate us where we don't know. As you can see, even at this stage, there's a fair amount of geographical representation, but there's also, looking at the faces, you'll also see that there's years of experience there as well. And hopefully the ideas that we do thrash out on these Sunday afternoon discussions will contribute to the present generation of activists and those following us. Canada is one of those ones which it's a bit like Ireland in my mind, in that it's often seen as an appendage of something bigger. That in the world media, occasionally it's happened that Ireland has been just considered to be part of Britain. Canada, for its sins, has often been considered to be part of the United States. And what we're hoping that you can do, John, is to educate us on the uniqueness of the labour movement in Canada, on its historical development, on the opposition that it faces, both directly from the employer class and indirectly, or even directly, from the political representatives, from the legal eagles and the legislators. Recently, the issue of the teachers' dispute has managed to escape into the world media, and I understand you will be passing some information on that. So the floor is yours, John. Typically 20 minutes, and it's a target, not a mantra.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, comrades. I think I'm going to focus a great deal of what I have to say on the particular education workers' struggle that has broken out. And I think that will point to some broader questions about the Canadian situation that people might want to follow up on in terms of the discussion. But before I talk about that specific struggle of 55,000 education workers here in Ontario, I think it would be good just to make the observation that struggle, like pretty well any trade union struggle that's going to happen at the moment, takes place against the backdrop of the severe cost of living crisis and the impact that is having on working class people. So in that regard, I think I should point out that in the 2008-2010 crisis, Canada, while it was affected very considerably relative to many other places, and particularly south of the border, didn't have the same level of dislocation. There wasn't a collapse of the housing market the way there was in the United States. The impact wasn't generally as great. But as we go into this crisis, that's not really the situation. Inflation here is running at just less than 7%, which is very significant, but not exceptional on an international scale. But what is the particular vulnerability in Canada is the incredible explosion of the housing market and household debt that has occurred since the Great Recession. So that you have household debt in Canada, the highest within the G7. And you have the gap between house prices and income, probably the worst within the OECD. And Toronto at the moment, where I live, has is reckoned by some official body that studies housing bubbles, says that the housing bubble in Toronto is world class, is greater than other cities. So as that has taken place, with interest rates now being driven up, you are seeing a dramatic decline in house sales. People are losing their housing. But what that's causing is a switch over to the rental market. And the sudden pressure on the rental market has caused an inflationary round, so that rents are shooting up in Canada at the moment, particularly in the major urban centres like Toronto, an absolutely devastating situation. So that is the context in which 55,000 education workers, that would be librarians, custodians, people working within the school board system in Ontario, found themselves dealing with. So you have this, it's a workforce that is disproportionately women, disproportionately racialized, and moreover, the cuts to public education that have taken place over the last period have hit them very hard. About a 10% real wage cut took place for education workers between 2011 and 2021. So that was before the cost of living crisis hit. So when it hit, it had a particularly devastating impact on them. Now, we're dealing in Ontario, and remember the federal structure here means that the provincial level of government has a very major share of responsibility. We're dealing with a government here that is very right-wing, very aggressive, very committed to austerity, a conservative government. The term Tory is used here as well, headed up by a man called Doug Ford, who has frequently been compared to Donald Trump, very much the right-wing populist type figure. But he's also surprisingly erratic in terms of his behavior, and he has a tendency to attack, and then when he meets serious opposition, back off. So it's like he has the political instincts of a Ronald Reagan or a Margaret Thatcher, but not the backbone. So that's the kind of situation that we're dealing with. So CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, went into this round of negotiations with a real desire to try to make some substantial gains, to catch up, at least to try to catch up in terms of the decline in wages and the erosion of working conditions that have taken place. And it was clear that the Ford government was not engaging in any good faith bargaining process, that they intended to impose. An intensified wage cut in real terms on those workers. And so the union set a strike deadline for the workers for November the 6th. Now, at that point, Ford put into effect something that clearly he'd been planning all along. So he introduced, I mean, you can use the term back to work legislation, but that sort of rather implies that people are on strike. He actually preemptively brought in back to work legislation called the Keeping Students in School Act, or Bill 28. He brought this in, imposed it. It made it illegal for the workers to go on strike, and it imposed on them a vicious concessionary contract that they had no options but to accept in legal terms. And the other thing he did was quite remarkable. Canada has a fairly robust constitution that was repatriated from Britain in 82, that includes a charter of rights and freedoms. And I don't want to wax sentimental about this piece of legislation, but it does provide, I think, some fairly substantial rights that people can claim. And the Supreme Court of Canada in 2015 had ruled that the right to strike was a constitutionally protected activity. Now, that meant in practice that back to work legislation is still brought down by governments, but they've always had to be inordinately careful to demonstrate that what they were doing was in the so-called public interest and that every reasonable effort had been made to negotiate a contract with the workers and such like. What happened in this case was Ford was clearly violating the constitutional rights. But when the Constitution was repatriated in '82 because of provincial government opposition, the federal government put in place something called the Notwithstanding Clause. The Notwithstanding Clause gives governments the power to violate constitutional rights and then protect themselves from any legal challenge. So the Notwithstanding Clause, which was described when it was adopted as the nuclear option, was used by Ford, and the establishment was aghast. But he's a rather crude operator, and so he went ahead with this measure. Well, what happened was that they had severely miscalculated. CUPE, certainly to the amazement of the Ford government, announced that they were going to defy the legislation. They were not going to defy it simply with a one-day strike. They were going to carry out an indefinite strike, even though every single education worker was facing a $4,000 a day fine, and and the union was facing $500,000 a day. They said they would go ahead in the face of that and organize an indefinite strike. So on the Friday of that week, the strike begins. They're calling it a protest to try to give themselves some legal protection, but clearly it's a strike. They're going ahead with their strike. And at that point, 12,000 members of the Ontario Provincial Service Employees Union, so the provincially employed level of the public service, they come out as well. And then an alliance of trade unions comes together and declares that there are going to be sympathy strikes organized all across the province. This includes Unifor, which is the largest private sector union, including all the car plants and such like. They announced that there's going to be sympathy strikes in the private sector as well. Well, at this point, they're in trouble. They don't quite know what to do. The legislation is clearly going to be defined. This is massive. The opinion polls are showing overwhelming support in support of the strikers. The Ford government is on the ropes, and he's no stalwart. He's no class warrior. He's got himself in big trouble, so he didn't quite know how to proceed. So one unnamed government representative tells the media, we just didn't think they would do that. We didn't think they would strike illegally. We don't know what to do. So they're in disarray. So at that point, the Alliance of Unions is about to hold a press conference to announce their plans for province-wide disruption. The Ontario president of CUPE is saying a general strike is absolutely a possibility. At that point, Ford calls his own press conference a half an hour ahead of theirs and says, if the unions will stop the strike and come back to the bargaining table, I will repeal the legislation. So this is when the thing gets incredibly messy and complicated in terms of how to analyze it. There's no question that there has been a major victory won. There is no question that the withdrawing of that legislation is enormously important. But what happens almost reflexively is the union leadership announces that they will accept those terms, that they will go back to work. At this point, just to sort of update what has happened, is Ford said that he would put an improved offer on the table. They met during the course of this last week, and the negotiations were unsuccessful. So the union has set a new strike deadline for Monday. At this point, they're negotiating over the weekend. It's not clear whether there'll be a settlement or whether there'll be another round of strike activity. But if it happens, it will be a sort of a more normal kind of a employer-worker dispute. They won't be operating under they won't be operating under the gun of this legislation, and there will not be the same alliance of unions ready to organise sympathy actions. So in terms of an assessment of the situation, and this is my own assessment, I strongly believe that this represented in many ways an important gain, in many ways an important victory. But at the same time, I think it fell short in terms of what could have been achieved. I mean, my assessment of Ford is that his government was in disarray. There was a huge popular mood. People, not just in unions, but in communities, had a strong sense that this represented a lead in the whole struggle against the cost of living crisis and the austerity agenda that's being imposed on people. I think it was a dramatic opportunity. And in terms of the individual dispute with the educational workers, I think there is absolutely no question that had they said, we're not calling off our strike until we get an offer that is acceptable, the strike continues, I think they could have made very substantial gains at that by proceeding in that way. So I think that what this raises in terms of Canadian unions, and I don't believe the lesson is unique to Canada, is that what you have is a situation where the whole framework of employer union relations has been brought under the ambit of a state-sanctioned regulatory system of compromise, in which workers' struggles will not be generalized, workers' struggles will be compartmentalized and contained. And I think there was what was exposed was a situation where the Ford attack was so egregious, so outrageous, that for a period there was a readiness to defy. But once any kind of a compromise was put on the table, there was a backing away. And it harkens back to something very, very significant that I think in Ontario is an absolute benchmark in terms of struggle, is that in the 1990s, you had in this province a Conservative government under the leadership of a man called Mike Harris. And Harris was probably the most Thatcher-like regime that Canada has seen. He implemented something that he called the common sense revolution, which was a whole series of brutal austerity measures, attacks on workers' rights, etc. And what he did was so extreme and so sudden and so devastating that in response, with some reluctance and foot dragging and what have you, an alliance of unions came together at that time. And they organized something called the Ontario Days of Action. And what these were, though they never used the term, they were city by city general strikes. And they involved very effective strikes within individual cities, and they moved from one to the other. There were about 15 of them, I believe. And they had a huge impact, and they mobilized people enormously. The Toronto one was the largest mobilization of people that's occurred in Canadian history. It was a dramatic and incredible campaign. But at the same time as this was happening, there was never any stated plan to escalate them. There was never any clear articulation of the objectives. They were simply there to try to make an appeal to the government to change direction. And so after a period of doing this, they were wound down, they were brought to an end. And that represented the last example of this kind of, working class defiance outside of the framework of compromise. And it represented, while it had its limitations, it represented an enormous mobilization. And what was said in Ontario again and again by people was that the Days of Action were a level of mobilization and a kind of a fight back that couldn't be replicated in the present period. And I think that was shown to be entirely wrong by this recent episode. You had a situation where, coming out of nowhere, nobody saw it, least of all Doug Ford, but probably not the union leaders, and I'll say I didn't. You had this incredible potential For a period, there was a readiness to fight back. It was a generalized movement. It had a way of uniting people. It was an absolutely incredible development, and it was really pivotal. And I think it raises real lessons about what must be done in this situation. Because clearly, if there were a higher level of organization within the rank and file, if there were a stronger left, the ability to just simply say, well, Doug Ford put something questionable on the table, we're just going to cancel the strike for now, that wouldn't have been an option. A working class, rank and file working class movement and a strong left could have made that retreat impossible. And I think, comrades, the simple reality is that unless we find the way forward to that kind of powerful, united, unauthorized method of struggle, we're not going to build the kind of fight back that we need in this period of multi-layered crisis that capitalism is passing through. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, John, I thank you. And that has been a brilliant introduction, because you covered in great detail that is missing completely from the media that we have access to. The lessons obviously are, I hate using the phrase because it's used too much, but snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory. But it certainly is something like that. I would ask any of the comrades, anybody want to come in at this stage? I can't see hands, so if anybody wants to just start talking.
Ed's got his hand up, Jimmy.
Ed, I see it now.
Ed, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, John, for a really interesting introduction to this discussion. A very, very inspiring introduction, and to me, humbling, because I had no idea that this was going on really until I read the invitation to come to this meeting. You know, so it teaches me the importance of following the news in Canada, but I think there's so many places in the world where this kind of thing is happening that the question is, I mean, I understand fully your really clear description, John, of how you know this right-wing government sort of attempted to bully and then provoked the education unions themselves. What impressed me in the story that you told is the willingness, the readiness, even the spontaneity with which other unions offered to come in to help. And my question is, did that kind of solidarity just blow up from nowhere, completely unforeseen? Or has there been a process in the making of that, you know, unions coming together, joint actions, things like that? You know, to what extent is it the responsibility of new layers of the working class suddenly thinking something's got to be done, in comparison to, is it the consequence of years of patient work by, you know, trade union officials and things like that? That's the question.
Okay. Jimmy, do you want to take a few questions, or you want me to answer them one at a time? Or?
Well, I see who else is offering. I see Matthew has his hand up. We'll take him next.
Yeah, really following on from what Ed has said, and again, I mean, I think your introduction was great. What could you say something about the state of the left in Canada? Because obviously the key question is, you know, really obviously the union bureaucracy itself clearly wanted out of that situation as fast as possible. And if they'd had anything, as you say, if they'd had anything about them, they'd have been put in a list of demands saying, right, okay, well, you guys are a mess, we'll have this quick, you know, before we call it off. And instead what they did was just to call it off. You know, so clearly the union, it's nothing to do with the union proxy whatsoever. But, you know, it's then to say, oh, what is the state of organisation in terms of, you know, left political organisations, etc., and, you know, more generally in the working class, you know, that actually produced this, you know, eruption, you know, and it is then also a process of drawing, you would hope, political conclusions from that by the workers involved. I mean, obviously, starting with the education support workers as the first point. What's their view? I mean, obviously, has there then been a degree of political discussion? You would hope, that really they've been done. I mean, they've been swindled. They could have had everything, and then it's been taken away from them. So you would hope there would be a fury, and B, right, we're not having this ever again. This is going to be done differently. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think the words that are missing there from your finish is "we was robbed." Any other comrades ready? Dominic, John.
Okay.
Yes, Dominic, it's just a short point. I don't know anything about the situation in Toronto as far as the left or the trade union leaders are concerned. But given what happened and what followed, I would take the view the trade union leaders, having seen what the provincial government was prepared to do, looked at the situation and said, if this carries, if this is what's going to be the future, there won't be any unions. Because what's the point of union negotiators if you can't negotiate? If you could see redundancy ahead, I think that seems to me to be the message, because when they got the chance to put the boot in and to consolidate it, get guarantees that this would never be used again, that a decent offer had got to be put on the table, that this government had got to treat workers' rights correctly and, use the strength that they had, they just backed out of it. They did re-establish their role as a sort of go-between man between the employer and the workers. That's my reading of what the situation is there. Anyway, I'll finish on that. It's only a short point.
Okay, John, do you want to come back and comment on those or take it out again?
Yes. Well, in terms of, I mean, I think it's necessary to recognise that everyone was shocked. Pretty well everyone was shocked by how this unfolded, including, I'm sure, all of the education workers. At this point in Canada, there has not been, I would have said the situation here was behind the UK in terms of any effort to generalise. So something like, enough is enough or whatever. There hasn't been any steps in that direction significantly at all. There hasn't been much of a lead given by the Ontario Federation of Labour, for example. You haven't seen much of a lead given at all. If you go to at the federal level, the Canadian Labour Congress, so clearly the equivalent to TUC, you go to their website and they say take action. And that takes the form of the ability to sign a petition or to read a brief to a government committee. So there's no real lead being given, but at the same time there are indications that people have precisely had enough. I mean, I don't have a breakdown province by province, but Ontario has about 40% of the population of Canada, so it's what happens here is very, very significant. And strike figures this year have absolutely shot up. People have come out on strike. There's been no real lead given, but it's emerged. I mean, so clearly what happened with the education workers absolutely was driven by a rank and file mood. It absolutely was there. What you've also seen is, and perhaps a reflection, perhaps there's a connection, but you've seen somewhat more left leaders move into top positions in the last while in Canada. So you have a woman called Lana Payne leading the largest private sector union, Unifor, perhaps could be somewhat comparable to like Sharon Graham's role. So you're seeing a bit more space opened up there, not to exaggerate or romanticize, but a bit more space. Similarly, JP Hornick elected as president of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and again, no wild leftist, but compared to what was before, probably a foaming Bolshevik by comparison to what existed previously, the most wretched collaborationist leadership imaginable, and that's gone. So that does open up a bit more space. In terms of the state of the left, the Social Democratic Party here is the New Democratic Party, the NDP. So nothing comparable to the Corbyn project has happened within the NDP. Very third way sort of approach. No great lead being given there at all. In terms of the broader left, union activists, members of left organizations, etc., I would say there's sadly been quite a division. There's a lot of people on the left who are simply saying that this is a great victory. This is the first post-pandemic victory. The bill was defeated. That's the real victory. The union leadership took the position where we're demobilizing the movement, but we can go back on strike anytime we want to. Nothing has been lost, which is, of course, an absurd argument. But that is being parroted by large sections of the left. There are a lot of critical voices. I would say within the education workers themselves and within the QP union in a broader way, lots and lots and lots of dissatisfaction. And there are discussions taking place about the possibility of trying to bring this together, to try to find organizational form for it. There's no particular left party or left current that is in a position to by itself give a lead. If that's going to happen, it's going to require a kind of it's going to require an alliance, a de facto alliance to bring it together. But I think it remains at this point a real possibility. This has been an incredibly sharp lesson for people, both in terms of what was possible, but in terms of what was lost. And I think that's true. And I would just like to say, in response to Dominic's point, that I think the assessment is absolutely correct. They put the Ford attack was so egregious that it really didn't leave the union leadership a great deal of choice. They either had to submit to something that was absolutely crushing and unprecedented, or they did have to organize a fight back. And the frame of reference that Ford himself had established with the legislation meant that only an illegal strike and defiance was any kind of valid way forward. But what is striking is how rapidly that came off the table. I've always drawn on the example that's in Nyron Bevan's book, where he talks about, some of you I'm sure have heard of this, talks about a meeting that took place in 1919 between the leaders of the Triple Alliance and Lloyd George at Number 10. And in it, Lloyd George says to the leaders of the Triple Alliance, basically, we know that you've created such a powerful instrument that if you strike, you will defeat this government. We can't rely on the army. We're in major trouble. You're going to defeat us. And he says, but if a force arises within the state that is stronger than the state, it must be prepared to take over the functions of the state or withdraw and accept the authority of the state. Have you considered? And if you have, are you ready? And the miners' leader, Smiley, at that point says, at that moment, we were beaten and we knew we were beaten. Now, what was interesting about that was at a meeting after the Days of Action, I remember referencing that at a public meeting, and some elderly retired auto worker put his hand up. He says, I was at a meeting of union leaders that said exactly the same thing. So I think that was the moment that was created where the very vulnerability, the very power that they'd unleashed became impossible for them to proceed with without utterly abandoning their role as compromisers.
So that's a tune we've heard too often too. Ian?
Yeah, thanks for just trying to get the light on a bit where I was in the. Yeah, thanks for this report on this really inspiring struggle. Like a couple of other comrades have said, I didn't know anything about, and probably should have done, and will certainly spread the word of now. What I'd like to ask about is another kind of Canadian labour struggle, if you will, that has caused a lot of debate on the left earlier on this year, even in Britain, which is the truckers' dispute. It's been very controversial, obviously, the whole issues around the vaccine. But I think even people who are very, very critical of the truckers said the mandates were authoritarian and wrong. I think the medical reasoning for them, I think the vaccine's good for you to take if you've not got any underlying conditions. It's probably going to make the disease less severe. But in terms of stopping the spread, it's not that you get it and you don't spread it on. So in terms of that, it was from management from government very draconian approach, and even more so the freezing of accounts, which could obviously be used against any activists of any political stripe. But on the other hand, the organising forces behind it, or so I've read, were actual strike breakers, the United We Roll gang. So whether or not the right-wing element in the actual protests in Ottawa were exaggerated or not, that kind of element behind it is, well, if you're trying to use identitarian arguments about you have to support it because it's working class, it shows how little political education there is behind people saying, well, you have to support a scab organisation because it's working class. So it's become something of a culture war dispute. Obviously, Trudeau, who it was against, is the antithesis of Rob Ford in culture war terms, but much less so in class war terms, which is actually much more important. So I just wonder what your take is on the truckers' dispute and on how this dispute intersects with that. I'm thinking if we pose one against the other, I don't know if that would be a good idea, or if it would be, it could play into the hands of the right-wing populists who prefer the truckers, and they'd say, well, truckers, blue collar, teachers, white collar. You were against Ford, who's an easy target. We were against Trudeau, who some people think is this lovely liberal. So yeah, what's the position do you think we should take in terms of the truckers? Obviously, there's elements of it, even in their attacks on Trudeau, conspiracy theories that Fidel Castro was his father, and that explains why he's a bad one, that no leftist could support. And as I say, can't be an identitarian workerist in support of scabs. That's just bizarre, even from the point of view of working class identity itself. But at the same time, maybe this dispute we could weave in to, because I've seen a lot of good people too, supporting the truckers for the best of reasons as a fight back, that maybe use that to broaden out the picture of Canadian Labour politics for them. Just your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Okay.
I don't see any other hands up at the moment, so I just want to throw a question in under the base of those previous comrades. One of the things that I've noted, John, over the years, particularly in the engineering industry, there's an awful lot of United States-based unions have organization in Canada. The question that I would ask is, apart from the affiliations and a head office somewhere in the States, how much autonomy exists in the Canadian unions? And is there any danger at any stage that if the Canadian unions were to make declarations or to organize alliances, that they could be undermined by leaderships in the United States?
Yes, okay. Yeah, well, let me try and deal with both of those. First of all, the truckers.
Sorry, John, there seems to be a problem with sound just at the moment.
Oh, can you hear me now? Or?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, okay. In terms of the truckers, I would say that the events that took place, they're working class credentials were pretty fraudulent. The people that organized it, Ian very correctly identified the United We Roll convoy, a pro oil and gas industry mobilization that had brought a convoy across the country previously, a convoy of trucks across the country previously, and the same people were involved in the organization of the recent trucker convoy. Whatever we think about issues of vaccine mandates, or the fact is that the organizers of that were a group of fascists, people like Pat King, who has, if you ever want to check him out, he has a bit of a weakness for YouTubes, so he blabs away freely about his beliefs. You can find one in which he talks about the white race being displaced in Canada, and very soon, if we don't fight back, the official languages of Canada will be Mandarin and Hebrew. So giving you a bit of a sense where he comes from. Tamara Like, all these other people, a Western, largely Alberta-based core of unassailably fascist organizers. They presented themselves as a trucker convoy. There were significant numbers of people who drive trucks for a living involved, but these were owner-operators. These were not people that worked for an employer and drove trucks. Moreover, the trucking industry, I mean, 20% of truckers are South Asian in Canada. There is a real, it's faced privatization and deregulation on an incredible scale. Wage theft is rampant. Organizations that actually represent real working employed truckers made clear that they have much bigger issues to worry about than vaccine mandates. And so I would reject the notion that it was clearly the far right has latched on to the issue of vaccine and public health measures, etc. And I think this was just part of the process of doing that. What is amazing is that this was the largest far right-led mobilization in Canada since the 1930s. And I think it speaks to the questions we've been talking about. The fact that the lack of a fighting working class movement has become so dire that it is possible for the political momentum to be generated by a bunch of brown shirts posing as workers is really, really unfortunate. And despite the fact, I would certainly agree that the base of people that were mobilized, there would have been very, very different elements within it. But the key organizers were clearly far right, and the bulk of the people they mobilized were organized around a very right-wing agenda. You can watch footage of them getting up and saying, you can watch footage of one particular speech where a speaker identifies herself as a white supremacist and rapturous cheers from the crowd. I mean, it's absolutely clear to me what they were. There's no working class credentials. There's no legitimacy in that movement whatsoever. On the contrary, they're the people we should be sweeping off the streets as far as I'm concerned. With regards to the role of unions that are cross-border based in the United States and have their head offices in the United States, there are still a significant number of those. It's true. The United Steelworkers of America would perhaps be the best example. And there have frequently been tensions between, though there's significant autonomy in Canada, there's frequently been tensions, more right-leaning leaderships to south of the border trying to prevent activity. The mine workers in Nova Scotia in the 1920s, led by a man called J.B. McLaughlin, took up absolutely pivotal struggles at that time as part of the United Mine Workers Union, and the leadership in Washington absolutely functioned as strike breakers, and so there was a bitter history there, and many such examples of that. The Canadian Union of the Canadian Auto Workers Union, which is now merged and become this Unifor formation, came out of precisely that kind of a struggle in the 1980s, where the UAW as a whole wanted to impose concessionary contracts, and the demand of the Canadian section to reject concessions led to a split in the organization and led to the formation of the Canadian Auto Workers Union. So there's a whole history of that. But in the present round of struggle, the leading forces were public sector unions that are not international in nature; they're Canadian based, and Unifor is now a Canadian union as well. So there wasn't any element of that in the present situation.
Oh, thanks. Can I just ask a question here? Did anybody beside me have a freeze, or was it just my own internet went down? No, it's just my problem. So if I disappear again, sorry. Any other comrade want to come in and add or develop the discussion as it is? Roger. You're muted, Roger.
I don't really have a point to make, but I just think, like probably everybody here, I'm just fascinated by the clear account that John has given of these events. But it's obviously very rich in lessons for all of us. And it struck me how similar the situation that is developing in Britain could be. We now have an official rate of inflation of 11%, which is predicted to go up to at least 15% and probably higher. We have officially, again, according to official statistics, that there is going to be a 7% drop in living standards over the next 18 months, which is the sharpest drop ever in record since records began. We also have a fast developing strike wave. Probably it'll end up with the biggest days lost in strikes probably since the 1970s. And at the same time, we have a viciously right-wing government which is preparing draconic new laws. People aren't really quite aware of it yet, but laws against public protest demonstrations and direct attacks on the right to strike. So I think it's very likely that we're going to have a similar kind of confrontations in the offing here. And that's why I think the lessons of what happened in Canada really need to be learned. First of all, the potential readiness of the working class to fight back and to stand firm in the face of a really direct provocation, but also the need to not to lose a grip by just not to be satisfied with small token concessions on the part of the ruling class, and you know that you can't switch on or off the readiness of the working class to strike, and you have to actually push it forward until you get substantial concessions and something that you can really be regarded as a victory. So I don't really have anything more to say on that, but I think we really need to follow what's happening in Canada, and I hope that John will stay in touch with us and you know, keep us informed. As like one of the comrades said before, I didn't really have. I had a vague understanding that something was going on in Ontario, but I didn't know the details of the struggle until I read. By the way, John wrote a really brilliant article about it, which I hope he will give us permission to circulate that and republish that. So please, let's keep in touch, and thanks very much for your report.
Thank you so much.
Just check with any other comrades. Even comrades who've made a previous contribution want to add to it. Matthew.
Sorry, if I can get on. I don't know, my camera's in the work now. Sorry, I'm just going to say, mate, I was hoping you could give us some kind of notion of what the state of the left is in terms of Canada, particularly obviously the not the NDP, which of course is part of the government, but the actual far left organisations in terms of sort of size and positioning and all the rest of it, and whether or not there's been any development in those terms.
To be honest, I don't see a lot of evidence of major breakthroughs. The IS, which they never went over to calling themselves the SWP, the IS here is, I think, much weaker than it was. The organisation that calls itself Fight Back is has grown, but seems to have mainly a kind of a building the organisation rather than participate in the struggle kind of a focus for the most part. Rather weak. I don't think there's a great deal of strength, but there are certainly small organisations that I think are taking a generally positive approach, and there's some possibilities. I think it does require an ability to unite around definite objectives. I think, for example, in the situation we're in now with the education workers, there needs to be, and some of us are talking about trying to get some kind of meeting together to discuss ways in which we can cooperate around definitely agreed upon objectives. But I think for quite some time there hasn't been a really strong far left organisation in Canada. It remains a major problem.
John, could I just take that one step further in relation to not the far left, but the so-called democratic left, and whether or not they have any credibility in parliamentary terms that could pull workers into the idea of considering socialist ideas, and what is their relationship and what with the unions, and have they any influence with unions?
Yeah. You saw, of course, the big difference between Canada and the UK is the role that the Liberal Party plays, right? Because the Liberal Party here is a frontline major political formation. It didn't go into a state of faded glory in the early 20th century the way the Liberal Party in Britain did. So what had happened was that a section of the union leadership was gravitating towards the Liberals and moving away from any support even for the Social Democratic Party. That's been somewhat reversed. Some of the union leaders that are in now have broken with that direction. And so you do have some connection between trade unions and the NDP. The federal leaders, a member by the name of Jagmeet Singh, who has played a pretty conservative role, but has some working relationship with trade unions. Generally, the state of there hasn't been a strong. There are certainly left voices within the NDP, but there's nothing comparable to the developments that led to Corbyn. Right, nothing like that at all. The federal NDP at the moment is propping up Trudeau's Liberals with their votes in Parliament. They have an agreement, and they're just voting him and keeping him in power. At the provincial level, and the NDP has never held power at the federal level. It's very much the third party on a national scale. Provincially, it's held power in a number of places. British Columbia on the west coast. They form the government, and they are lackeys of the oil and gas industry. A serious environmentalist just put her name forward for leadership of the party, and an act of overt political gangsterism, they disqualified her, so that their shoo-in candidate could just get in. So I would say that things look quite bleak in terms of the NDP and social democracy, and any significant left movement emerging within it at this time. I couldn't rule it out, but I don't think it's any kind of practical possibility at this point.
Okay, thanks, John. Ed?
It's just another question. You know, we've heard a little bit about the state of the left, the democratic left and the far left. What about, you know, the more sort of spontaneous movements that come up on the street? And I mean, like when Black Lives Matter gripped the political scene in the United States, was there any response to that in Canada? You know, I'm talking about people who are not in any particular party and don't see themselves as politically, as organized politically in any traditional sense, but, you know, coming out because of their own oppression and their own wish to change things and improve the situation.
Yes.
Sorry, John, in answering that one, could I ask you to include a contribution on your own role with the Ontario Coalition to Poverty, because
yes,
it seems as if it's appropriate.
Yes. I mean, excellent question, Ed. I'm really glad you asked it. It really, there has certainly been a whole lot of community-based social resistance in Canada, and on an ongoing basis. When George Floyd was murdered by the cops in Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter upsurge certainly came to Canada. There was certainly big mobilizations. There was a woman who was pushed off of a balcony of a high-rise by the cops, a young Black woman, and that was a great focus. In this city, the figures show, in Toronto, the figures show that if you are Black, you are 20 times as likely to be shot dead by the cops as if you're white. So, I mean, no question that those issues have been ones in which that they've resonated. Black Lives Matter in this city has played an incredible role, a very, very powerful role, and an important one. The other thing in Canada that must be kept close attention to is the level of resistance by Indigenous people. Right? I mean, the situation that faces people outside of, that don't live in a country like Canada or United States or Australia, can't immediately grasp the enormity of the ongoing injustice that exists, right? I mean, on the reserves, which make up 0.2% of the land mass in this country, where people are abandoned, there is no clean drinking water. The people in Shoal Lake, are just on the Ontario side of the Manitoba-Ontario border, they provide out of that lake the water supply for the city of Winnipeg, but they can't drink their own water. I mean, it's an absolute disgrace. The Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the population of Canada. They make up more than 30% of the federal prison population. So, I mean, you can't talk about it enough. And there is a huge and explosive movement of Indigenous resistance that people have great respect for. At the moment, the federal government and the provincial government in BC are trying to drive pipelines through the territory of the Wet'suwet'en people. And there has been absolutely incredible resistance. People have set up camps, they fought back. In the early 2020, there was a movement of solidarity that brought rail lines, that brought shipping to a halt, that created a major economic and political crisis for the government. So that's very, very strong and a very, very major part of it. All kinds of community-based resistance, tenants resisting eviction. There's been an upsurge of that in Toronto with very, very militant actions, major confrontations, homeless people being driven out of parks by the police, just explosive, incredible struggles. Lots and lots of that happening. And I was, from just years ago when I emigrated to Canada, I almost right away got involved in anti-poverty organizing. And I found myself with an organisation called the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I spent 28 years as an organiser with OCAP, and that really drove home to me the possibility of organising amongst that part of the working class that is generally excluded from the workplace, that faces social abandonment, and the importance of that struggle. So yes, I think the community-based resistance side of the thing is very, very important. I talked about the days of action that happened in Ontario, where the unions called general strikes at city by city. There is no question that had communities not acted first and taken up mobilising against the Tory government of the day, the union leaderships would have, I think, just dragged their feet. So community-based resistance is an explosive and unknown quantity, but it needs to be paid great attention to.
Okay, John, thank you. You've probably been a little bit modest there, John, about your role with the Ontario Coalition. But the comrades will find out more about the work you've done as time goes on. Anybody else, comrades? Matthew again.
Sorry, Clyde. The only other thought, I suppose, that would be interesting to discuss is the Communist Party. Is there any fragments of it still left? What sort of role did it play in the past? I mean, did it have the deep grip of chunks of the organised working class as it did in many parts of Europe, or is it did it start as marginal and then does it still exist?
I'm sorry, Matthew, I couldn't quite make out what you said in terms of what you were referring to there.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about the Communist Party. I mean,
the Communist Party. Sorry, yeah.
So what sort of size and implantation did it have originally before the whole thing obviously broke apart?
Right.
And is there anything left of it?
Yeah. Yes, the Communist Party played a very major role. The Canadian Communist Party was formed in a town just outside of Toronto, Guelph, Ontario, in 1922, and played right from the start a very, very important role in the struggles that were going on. It moved over to a kind of it's Stalinist kind of perspective under the leadership of a man called Tim Buck, who came from Norfolk originally, and it played a very significant role in many ways, and continued to. In the 1930s, just as Wal Hannington and the National Unemployed Workers Movement played a very, very big role, and that was CP led. Very similar here. The big explosive unemployed movements of the day were led by, for the most part, by Communist Party activists. Their combativity was unassailable. Their third period politics was problematic and limited what they could do to a significant degree. But yes, the Communist Party here played a very, very big role and continue to. And I believe at the moment, actually, the remnant of the Communist Party that exists is actually experiencing something of an upsurge in membership recruitment.
Good, comrades. Anybody? John, I'm going to pass it back to you again and ask you if you want to take advantage and make it general or an overall summation of your contribution, or any questions that you want to raise.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think there's much I need to say, Jimmy, but first of all, I just thank everybody so much for this discussion. It was really, really interesting and enjoyable to boot. And I think, Roger's point about the similarities between the situation here and the lessons to be learned are really well said and very, very important. And I think, I happen to be in a situation where at this moment, the place where I live has seen this important struggle. But I think everywhere people should draw lessons from it and think in terms of how it applies to their own situation, their own struggles. And just generally, I mean, I think we're in a situation that is incredibly explosive, and the possibilities to see real gains in terms of, yes, working class movements and combativity, but also the kind of political development that's going to be necessary to take that forward is absolutely unprecedented. I don't think we can assess the class struggle with plodding arithmetic here at the moment. I think we need some algebra, and we need some variable quantities and whatnot to think in terms of the possibilities. And some of that emerges from this discussion. I value it a great deal. Thank you so much.
John, it's certainly been a privilege to have your ideas and experience brought to us. And I hope that this is only the start of something rather than just a day out. I see Ed's hand up. I was going to ask Roger to come in and bring us up to the agendas ahead for the weeks ahead. Ed, you wanted to say something?
No, Jim, you misread my hand. It was a clapping hand, not asking for stuff. But thank you, John, for your involvement in this meeting. It's been really very, very interesting and eye-opening.
Thank you on both sides.
Okay, Roger.
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to echo what Ed said. Do please, John, come back. We meet every week. We have comrades from, usually up to a dozen countries here. And we really do get, as we did from you, we get first-hand reports from the front line of class struggles around the world. And, I think we all learn a lot from comparing our experiences and sharing them. Next week, we have Matt Huber, who has written a book on climate change and class struggle. So I think this is obviously a crucial issue and a controversial issue. And I think it's going to be a great meeting. So I hope everybody will come and encourage other comrades to turn up too. Okay, that's it.
Okay, I see Ian has a hand up there.
Yeah, just on other meetings. I was just wondering if we're going to reschedule the Olaf Tam meeting with Maddie, because it looked like a really fascinating topic, and I was really sorry to see it cancelled. And I hope she's feeling better, or will be soon.
Okay.
Maddie, are you there? Maddie is,
yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. At the moment, I'm undergoing a number of tests. I've been very short of breath, which Roger can testify to. He saw me on Monday of the week, a week ago, just before I checked myself into hospital. So now I'm undergoing tests and x-rays and getting oxygen and all sorts of things to get me back on my feet. And once I know when and how I will be okay again, and then I will reschedule with Roger. But thank you for asking the question, because it's an unusual topic for Wynne, but I'm really glad to find out that there is some interest in it. For our speaker of the evening, the topic is who shot Olof Palme's murder from 1986 in Stockholm is the question, and I'm looking at the kinds of forces that might have been involved and where he came from and things like that.
Maddie, I can say it's going to be a discussion that's going to have a lively
yes, I believe so.
There's certainly opinions that will have a great interest in it. I'm going to conclude the meeting at this. John, again, last time I met John was about 1995, I think, at 6 o'clock in the morning in the Chicago restaurant. We said at the time, a meet again soon. So let's hope that soon eventually comes. Thanks, John. It's been brilliant. The rest of the comrades, I appreciate all the attempts and all the contributions. And next week, same time, same place. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you for a lovely,
Bye, John. Thank you.
fascinating
Bye,
evening.
comrades.
Bye-bye.
Bye.